Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is Martleby's Brunchitarium. Are you in the mood for brunch at questionably low prices? Here at Martleby's, we're being sued by over 14 prominent states. But don't let that stop you. If you're in Delaware, Honduras, or the new Ronkonkoma area and you're in the mood for breakfast, you're gonna love Martleby's. Try our new dinosaur egg. Like our hash browns? Ask for our spicy ketchup. Haters will say, this seems to be expired. Here at Martleby's, your family. Would you sue your family for food poisoning? No way. It's Martleby's, and it's pretty good, and we're making you waffles, and we swear they're not cardboard. So, bill paying's out of the way. Yankees versus Red Sox. Ali Frazier, Djokovic Nadal, Chaz Michaels, and Jimmy McIlroy. For as long as balls have existed, there have been rivalries. And now, a new chapter. Two gentlemen who are so evenly matched that people are already asking if they're sick of it. But wouldn't you rather maybe play somebody else in the finals? The journalists asked. They are out of questions, and yet have not asked any in quite some time. So, for me, for a lot of us, I think Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz have filled that gap that we didn't know if it would be filled. The post-Big Four era was initially one that felt a bit flat. Would Zverev actually play offense and take accountability? Would Tsitsipas fix his backhand or drop the tough guy act? Thankfully, the answer was no. Jannik and Carlos have filled that gap, and I think it would take something very special to beat either one going forward. For me, I think it's going to take, a very explosive offense coupled with a powerful athletic presence. He's a bit injury prone. They both are. But I'm looking at something like a peak Draper or Arthur Fils. When Fils locks into a good level with his ground strokes, he can be very aggressive. Same with Draper. Draper has a good enough serve to give them trouble, playing a lefty. It starts to look like the old big three, where the players who were able to pull the upsets were the guys with big power. Del Potro, Cilic, Wawrinka stands out as guys, that their offense is good enough that it doesn't really matter how good you are at times. They can take the racket out of your hand. These guys are able to elevate to the right level. Right now, the guys who are in that challenger mode, the question is for how long? For how long? We watched Felix put in a good performance, but, the dips in level just made it inevitable that Sinner would win. Even with the injury concerns or medical timeouts, it feels like Sinner and Alcaraz just seem able to play better tennis for longer than anyone else on tour. The clear number 3 at this point, Novak Djokovic. This might be a slightly frustrating time in his career, but I'm extremely grateful that he's, still playing. The Alcaraz-Djokovic match felt like it had, the inevitable outcome, but Novak doesn't really let that stop him. Honestly, I felt like he was a bit flat physically compared to some of the earlier rounds, and not having that physical strength caused him, a lot of trouble. They traded even for a while. The early break for Alcaraz in the first is one you can kind of write off. It just felt like whenever Alcaraz, got to hit a forehand inside in, or just kind of rip into and flatten out a forehand, that Djokovic couldn't really hurt him from there. He couldn't really respond. Driving that ball cross court when he goes inside in for effect, it takes a lot of strength and balance. It's a durable shot. And, the same issue Felix was having against Zverev. Zverev was having against Felix. Zverev just couldn't get out of trouble when Felix drove his forehand to Zverev's forehand. To a much lesser extent, that's kind of what I looked at here. It felt like anytime Alcaraz really drilled the ball with his forehand, Djokovic was just looking to get a little depth or height and never really escaped. He was able to put the ball back, but from there he was scrambling. And, Novak is just not as automatic on defense as he used to be. He went up an early break in the second, but the 0-2 break is the hardest one to hold on to in tennis. And when you give it back towards the end of the set, it also is the largest emotional swing to kind of go through. Djokovic, has great presence and good perspective. He's a great competitor, but when you need to win that set and you give the break back, it hurts a little. Alcaraz also only relinquished one break point the entire match. It was a really effective serving performance from him despite, his percentage being too low. He was at 54% against Novak. This is too low to beat Sinner generally. But he won 84% of those first serves, so it's interesting. He's really hitting his spots when his first serve lands, and they're fairly unreturnable. The sound it's making coming off his racket doesn't really match the miles per hour they're showing on the screen. It's just been really hard for people to deal with Alcaraz, and it's also, it's making it tough to break him because he's serving his normal style, normal pace, and then when there is a big point, he's able to dial up a bit extra speed. And, since he goes wide, it's just really hard on a break point to return a first serve that goes wide unless you're sitting on it. And, it's hard to guess, when you're not getting a ton of break points. Maybe if you're getting a bunch, you guess on one because you feel like there's a tendency. But with Alcaraz, you're just not seeing that many. Sinner's a bit quicker than Djokovic, but it's likely that Alcaraz is going to have, a lot of comfortable holds of serve. Not the whole match. Obviously, these guys, top players, I tend to think who's serving matters a little less with the big three type players at that level. You're going to see a lot of deuce games. Who wins the big points obviously wins the match. But I think, Alcaraz is going to be able to hold serve maybe a little easier than he has in the past. Alcaraz hasn't dropped a set this tournament on the way to the finals. It's the first time anyone's done that since Federer in 2015. Federer actually lost that final to Djokovic. Not trying to jinx him, but, just a tremendous result to be getting through. And honestly, that's the level these guys are getting to, where, these other players winning a set. Felix wins a set in the semifinals of a major, and we go, wow, what a great performance for him. It's a testament to, the work these guys have put in and how long they've been grinding to get to this level, and how much work they've put in once they got to the level to keep this rivalry going. Because the rivalry doesn't stay interesting unless the players continue to improve, and it feels like both of them have this season. Heading into the hard court swing, I've said before that I felt like Sinner was a little bit better, a little bit more of a favorite here. If you were throwing out odds, I'd say like minus 150 maybe to win this tournament. He'd almost dethroned Alcaraz on clay. He managed to win the Wimbledon title where Alcaraz had kind of, established himself. And Sinner won Australia. So things have shifted a bit since then. All the concerns here are physical. The tennis, very evenly matched, but, just physical concerns. Sinner had to withdraw from Cincinnati with an illness. He seems better here, but the Cincinnati finals kind of was a reminder of the physical troubles he had early in his career. We're always peering at him when he starts to limp or looks fatigued. So Yannick's team obviously have gotten him into tremendous physical shape. I was watching his warm-ups today. He's doing complicated squats the day before. Listen, if I do squats today, I'm not playing tennis tomorrow. So last round he had to take a medical timeout for an abdominal issue. So despite, the shape he's in, there's a big question mark there. He said he felt better after the treatment. And that's the impossible question here. Is he telling the whole truth? These players are never really going to reveal the actual extent of an injury during a tournament. And, impress, they're very cagey. Let's say he's telling the truth. The numbers kind of reflect that. His serve numbers were really poor in the second set when he had the issue. And they recovered towards the end of the match. So, possible that he was okay. Possible the treatment fixed things. Possible he feels fine going into this match, though. My issue is that even if he feels fine, that exertion and strain that he had against Felix are probably minimal compared to what he can expect against Alcaraz. Can his body hold up? Can you beat Alcaraz in a hampered state? It's going to be really tough with the new level he has. Sinner for me is the more complete player at this point. Not that Alcaraz is lacking anything, but I think Sinner has ironed out his game and established, clear best practices and tactics more so than Alcaraz. Carlos is still a very free-flowing player at times, particularly when the scoreboard is in his favor or he's not yet in trouble. The first set, he's willing to go big and heat check himself maybe a little too often. Once he's down, that's when the grind begins. I think the unforced errors are minor, and he's so good that he's able to convert a lot of the crowd-pleasing shots that he's going for. But it's just a very tiny leak in his game, and one Sinner doesn't have. So in a matchup like this, just the very tiny leaks and momentary blinks are what you kind of have to look at. 4 sets with Felix Auger-Aliassime, obviously not what anyone expected, but the head-to-head data told a different story, one that I think I partially ignored and a bunch of people did. Felix had won a few matches in the past, came in at a great level, There were a number of unforced errors against De Minaur, but, those were present, but not in a disastrous way against Sinner. He couldn't win the match because of them, but he was competitive, despite them. I think, there's a fallacy in tennis predictions, and I've suffered from this, that, a player has to play the same way they did the round previous in the next round. You get through that close match where you were struggling with some, conditions or your opponent's ball, and, you get free, you go practice, you fix things, and you come out and you play better. I think a lot of players play better round by round, and felt like Felix did. Felix made a bunch of errors, but I feel like you don't want to make them in bunches, right? But if you're looking to have a good result and you can't really win the match, it's better to kind of do things the way he did. I felt like he made the errors in single games. He'd make 2 or 3 in a row. He dropped the first as a result. He dropped the third as a result. But the second and the fourth saw him really commit to grinding things out, and he looked, almost even there. I think there was a bit of, I wouldn't say gamesmanship, but the strategy to get by for Sinner kind of made it simpler for Felix. One thing I saw was Felix was hitting his forehand inside out very often. Sinner was content just to kind of return these. Gradually, he got a bit more and more careful until he started to make errors. That is what tends to happen. You're looking to put one more ball back and test your opponent, and you get a little too careful with the swing. You decelerate a little bit more. The backswing gets a little bit shorter, and then eventually you push one into the net, and you're furious, but that's how it goes. The book on Felix is that he'll give you unforced errors. So, I wonder if Sinner will play the same way against Alcaraz. I doubt it. When you play someone without a huge weakness, I think you tend to open up your game and shot selection a bit more. There's no reason to isolate one thing because it's just not going to work, and it's better to just play tennis. When you play Felix, obviously you're going to grind and look to minimize errors because it's generally a clear path to victory. In the end, Felix had chances and just didn't capitalize. It's as advertised. He had a handful of errors on break points. There were some very slow second serves that he faced, and he missed the returns. It was difficult to understand in the moment, because he has to make that return, but it reminded me that he does have some timing issues when the ball gets up high on his backhand. I think, this tournament, his backhand was solid at times, but it feels like I don't know the right technical way to say it, but the distance from his body where he's making contact varies a lot more than some other players from shot to shot. And the quality, I think, is more a result of him being good at tennis, and a good competitor than it is from him having, reliable technique. So, tremendous result for Felix here. Hopefully he takes the offseason to work on his backhand because, clearly he can compete at a high level. And I think early in his career, this is what was expected from him, that he would be at this level. There's no reason, he's young still. There's no reason that these guys can't make the jump. Even someone like Shapo, who had a good tournament here, the issues for Shapo are a bit mental. So, you can change that. You can put in the work. And, as a fan, I just want to see everyone improve. If Alcaraz, I think, had won Wimbledon, it feels like Sinner would absolutely need to win this in order to remain in the conversation. He's obviously the only other person in the conversation. But, the Cincinnati forfeit, let's say Alcaraz wins Wimbledon. He got fairly lucky in Roland Garros, wins Wimbledon. The Cincinnati forfeit starts to have things looking bleak, even though illnesses, stomach bugs can happen to anyone. As it stands, I think it's kind of flipped in a strange way. I was feeling a bit bad for Sinner because of the head-to-head, because of the, the trend, because of the Roland Garros final going into Wimbledon. Now it kind of feels like Alcaraz sort of needs to win this one, the way Sinner needed Wimbledon. I don't think Sinner's pulling away by any means. They're both staying very close and improving. I just think Alcaraz kind of reached a new peak as far as hardcourt tennis this fortnight. And Sinner just turned in a less than confidence-inspiring match. So, there are physical questions. Alcaraz is playing tremendous, and this is likely to be an extremely high-quality physical grind. So this one feels like it's one Alcaraz needs to grab. It's difficult for me. I go into this, I'm not entirely sure which player I really prefer. The finals of tournaments are really hard to analyze because at the end, you talk about them for 20 minutes and then you guess. You don't know who's going to win. You can have your feeling. You can say you knew it after they win, but it's more that you hoped it, you guessed it. I still see this one, even with Sinner having question marks around him, I still see it as dead even. because of the conditions. So the roof is likely to be closed here. The weather forecast in New York is unreliable. They put, it's been maybe 2 years of them just throwing up some percentage of rain every day, just a very low one, but just to kind of cover things. They do have numbers, I think, where they tend to get things right. If the rain percentage is less than 20%, you can go outside. They're just kind of covering their ass in case there's a drizzle. Once they get, once they're putting 30%, 40%, they are, generally aware of some significant rain, and they'll usually get it right. Today they had it at 40%, and it rained pretty heavy, and at the time that they said. Tomorrow it's at 50% around noon and 35% right when the match is scheduled to start. So the roof is going to be closed tomorrow. There's not actually much predicted for the rest of the day, so I'm sure the roof will be closed. I'm not sure timing-wise, as far as the start of the match, if they delay the match to open the roof and play it out like that, if they'll open it at all and risk it. I know they don't like to open it during the match. Anisimova was asking today, about the roof. She had a ton of issues with the lights attached to them. I'll get into that, I guess, maybe towards the end of the video, or maybe I'll do it now. Just felt like it was a big boost, to Sabalenka today. We always talk about the roof being closed, being good for servers, but it was just clearly on display today. Anisimova did have particular trouble with the lights that are on the roof. They were right where her ball toss is, she said. She said she just really couldn't see. Things compounded. It was frustrating for her, a difficult loss. I felt like the crowd today kind of let her down. The crowd's been really rowdy to the point of almost being rude at times. And today, they did the usual murmuring after a first serve fault for Sabalenka. But late in the second set, it felt like that's normally where they get fairly obnoxious. And they just didn't really have the energy today. I felt like when Anisimova scored a point, there was a lot of polite applause, but no real, they weren't on their feet. They weren't roaring. They weren't trying to force it to happen, which is, I think, the correct behavior. But strange to run out of juice right at the end of the tournament when Amanda kind of needed them, because she was in her own head. Her box gave her a finger to tell her to stop talking at one point. Maybe that's some signal they have going on. It just felt like she was very frustrated and needed a distraction off the court. And I think the crowd getting extremely into it, and bolstering her with just pure noise and energy would have helped. Yeah, anyway, the roof played a huge role in the women's final, and it really could here also. The roof closing, makes it less of a physical match. It helps servers, so that's a double boost for Sinner. I actually do think, if they play this outdoors, I think Alcaraz can win, based on what we've seen so far. Sinner's at a really high level, but Alcaraz is at a new level, hasn't dropped a set yet, and can win anyway. Sinner can be at his best, but you're not seeing him cook him, even though Wimbledon was 4 sets, could have easily gone either way, honestly. I don't see a huge gap between the two players at any point in their career. Even when Alcaraz was dominating things, it felt like Sinner was right there, just maybe not as physically strong yet. So he's changed that a bit. Alcaraz has improved his serving a bit. He's delivering some great serves this week. Sinner does tend to have slightly more unreturned serves in their matchup. So, there'll be some humidity tomorrow after the rainy weekend. But as far as fatigue, the weather is going to be between 65 and 70 degrees during the match. That's pretty perfect for tennis. So at the end of the day, it's a little boost for Sinner there. I don't see a huge strategic issue for either player. Alcaraz was very solid on defense with his backhand against Novak. That's the one place where he can sometimes make rally ball errors. He didn't play the drop shot very well, but Djokovic is very good at that, cat and mouse exchange, and sometimes wearing your opponent down is worth the drop shots. So you never know if his team, was fine with it and was telling him to definitely go for it. Even with not really having a good percentage of points won behind the drop shot, he still won the match in straights. So hard to really criticize him there. Especially, you never know how much the threat of that drop shot keeps the other guy hugging the baseline and lets the pace really work because, like I said, his forehand really gave Djokovic trouble. Djokovic likes to hug the baseline anyway, but if you happen to stand a little closer than you want to, you can get handcuffed at times. Both players here are hitting their forehand really well. Neither's really dominating on serve. They were both in the 50s last match, 53 for Sinner, 56 for Alcaraz. I think if one of them can get up, you know, 65% for serves, that'll be a big boost for them. I do expect them to play better here. The players tend to rise to the occasion. And, even though there's a ton of pressure here, it's really enjoyable to play against a very even competitor. You tend to be able to forget the game during the game and just play freely. That tends to make players play better. The more you're challenged, the more you get opportunities to really apply your skill. And, these are two tremendous players. So I think those numbers will rise a bit. I think they'll both get, above 55 for this match. I do think Sinner's a better returner. But, to circle back, to give the answer of who's going to win, I think the huge and the only question here, and it's the one I can't answer, is whether Sinner will be 100% able to exert. We saw Tommy Paul play through an abdominal issue. And, while he did well, he wasn't really able to get the extra pop on his serves. Sinner lunging for returns can be tricky also. He didn't really lunge well in that period where he had the app issue in the second. It felt like, he was just blocking back a lot of shots that he normally might take a powerful step and drive. I think Sinner being able to dial up a big delivery in a key moment is something that's been an extremely important part of this rivalry. So basically, the entire match hinges on it. I think if Alcaraz is able to drag him wide and make him lunge, he probably has a better chance of forcing him to aggravate the issue. So I expect to see him, hit a number of wide serves from the deuce court. Not a huge deviation for him either, so I think he'll hit a good percentage of them. He does tend to serve wide fairly often. That comes from coming up on clay, where that's, the generic pattern. But he does it very well, and I think being able to serve wide in big moments is something some of the best players have been able to do. Djokovic is a great spot server. He was always able to hit big T serves when he needed it. But Nadal's wide serve from the ad side, is a huge reason for the success in his career. Federer also would take a little off from the deuce court and go wide, pretty often. And at the top level, the analysts and coaches all talk about the value of having a big kick serve just for your second serve, and Alcaraz can do that. It's not something Sinner can't do, but I think that'll be Alcaraz's tactic. I can ramble for a few more minutes, but the question is just whether I think Sinner will be okay here. If he is, I like him to win. If he gets a medical timeout during the match, I believe Alcaraz will win the title. This is a huge non-committal answer, and, maybe people will be upset. But that's genuinely the situation. I can't answer the question. I can just point to the exact question. You're not going to get the information from tennis pros, really, until after the event. So Sinner in 4 is my initial pick. I feel like I was looking at that throughout the whole tournament, regardless of the level that Alcaraz brought. I feel like even though Alcaraz is playing better, he was able to score freely on Djokovic just by hitting the ball hard. I think that disappears against Sinner. Yannick trades power extremely well. So I think, as great and as dominant as Alcaraz looked against Djokovic, I think that avenue to success is just gone against Sinner. So, Sinner being a lockdown defender, more disciplined, I think is just a great boost over a long match. If we see a hampered Sinner, I like Alcaraz in 5. I'm sure I'm not allowed 2 picks, but this is the last video of the tournament, and I can always go into hiding if people are upset. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to post this. Hopefully you enjoyed listening to it, even though I haven't given you the answers to the exam. Best of luck if you're guessing.